Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents African Americans in the Revolutionary War by Lieutenant Colonel Retired Michael Lee Lanning. Narrated by Bill Andrew Quinn. Author to audience. Theoretically, history is first and foremost the chronological record of significant events. In practice, however, the gathering of dates and places is the least complex process of capturing the past. The difficulty in writing history is not the when and where, but the what and why. Complicating any effort to record events and their significance accurately and fairly is the fact that, along with inherent problems of locating sources and information, each historian brings his or her own agenda to a project. Rarely is history unfettered by the beliefs, feelings, values, and self-interest of the historian. Ultimately, and all too often, history becomes a record not of what actually happened, but the historian's interpretation of those events. Military history, in particular, offers classic examples of how written accounts reflect not so much the reality of wars and armed conflicts as the perspective of the historian assimilating and analyzing the events. To the victor go not only the spoils of war, but also the recorded version of the conflict. A predictable sequence of literature appears. Personal narratives are usually the first books published about a campaign or war. These works provide a valuable but narrow view, covering only the extremely small field of vision of the individual. Unit or ship histories are generally the next accounts to find their way into print, and these works focus almost exclusively on the loyalty, bravery, and dedication of the unit's soldiers or ship crews. The official histories appear soon afterward, written by victors, to whom victory alone stands as the justification for the war and its outcome. Histories by the defeated, if written at all, appear long after the fact as apologetic and remorseful renditions of the facts. After hostilities conclude, and for hundreds of years thereafter, academicians move in to pick the bones of decisions, actions, and accounts. They harvest the battlefield to assemble their versions of the conflict, which then becomes history. Unfortunately, many of these learned individuals record and interpret military operations without the insight of personal experience in uniform. Their results then reflect their personal agendas as much as their research. Nowhere are these factors and influences more evident than in what passes for the black history of the Revolutionary era. Footnote: only the histories about the Vietnam War come close in their unrelenting, blatant biases to those of the Revolutionary War. End of footnote. More than 5,000 black men joined the rebel Americans in the war as soldiers, sailors, and Marines. Many more supported the rebellion as laborers. Their service went largely unrecognized and unrecorded. Few letters, journals, or other narratives of black individuals about the Revolution exist because whites had denied most African Americans an education. White historians of the period, and for years after the war, ignored the contributions and impact of thousands of black participants for several reasons. First of all, prejudices were so deeply ingrained that it did not even occur to most whites of the time that black Americans had played a significant role either as individuals who fought or labored, or as a segment of the population that affected decisions. Prejudices also prevented some who did witness the contributions of African Americans from honestly reporting that black soldiers could perform equally with whites on the battlefield if given the opportunity. Others did not mention black soldiers because of the difficulty of explaining why the United States kept 500,000 men, women, and children enslaved while fighting for independence and liberty. Any study of the American Revolution, particularly in respect to participation by black Americans, faces obstacles in every aspect of the research process. Most writings on the war simply exclude or greatly downplay African American participation. Historians who do include accounts of black involvement in the Revolution tend to exaggerate their contributions and at times repeat unverified or unfounded stories. The predetermined agendas concerning black Americans, either positive or negative, of nearly all writers on the American Revolution clearly show through their narratives. Regardless of their veracity, existing publications contain in one form or another, most of the information known about the revolution and its participants. Little additional information is likely to be discovered. Even if an obscure diary or collection of letters surfaces, its impact will be small. The most extensive information source on the American Revolution is the cataloged, published, and minutely scrutinized collected papers of George Washington. Military records on file in the archives of the original 13 states provide other important resources. National records are few because many of the federal government files of the Revolutionary period burned in a fire at the Washington, D.C. storage facility in 1800. The British destroyed other period documents when they occupied the capital in 1814. As a result of sparse record-keeping of the time and the destruction of documents since, it is not possible to compile a complete listing of participants or even those who died in the American Revolution. The best estimate is that 300,000 rebel American soldiers and sailors served during the war, and that 4,000 to 7,000 died in battle. Another 18,000 died of disease and from other non-combatant causes. Unfortunately, these estimates are suspect. Available documents rarely mention race, making any estimate of African American participants and casualties in the Revolution all the more difficult. The following chapters are the result of the careful study of each piece of the puzzle, the fitting together of scattered fragments of information, and material deemed reliable to fill the glaring holes. A brief look at the major publications on Black participation in the Revolutionary War demonstrates the difficulties of research. For more than 50 years after the war concluded, published histories ignored the efforts of Black Americans in the conflict. In 1855, William C. Nell, a free black native of Boston, published the first detailed history of African Americans. Nell included in his Colored Patriots of the American Revolution a chapter on each state's black military and civilian participants. Nell's work, often described as more enthusiastic than scholarly because of his personal agenda to promote his race, includes many individual profiles and accounts that otherwise would have been lost forever. Harriet Beecher Stowe provides the best summary of Nell's book in its introduction, where she states, "The colored race have been generally considered by their enemies, and sometimes by their friends, as deficient in energy and courage. Their virtues have been supposed to be principally negative ones. This little collection of interesting incidents, made by a colored man, will redeem the character of the race from this misconception, and show how much injustice there may often be in a generally admitted idea." The next two publications about African American participation in the Revolution were a direct result of the Civil War. Both books provided official documents and letters relating the history and accomplishments of Black Americans in the Revolution, but their real purpose was to promote the emancipation of slaves and their enlistment as soldiers and sailors to help preserve the Union. George H. Moore, the librarian of the New York Historical Society, published Historical Notes on the Employment of Negroes in the American Army of the Revolution in 1862. George Livermore, a member of the Massachusetts Historical Society, produced the much more detailed and historical research respecting the opinions of the founders of the Republic on Negroes as slaves, as citizens, and as soldiers the following year. After the Civil War, the only significant work in the latter part of the 1800s was The Black Phalanx, a history of the Negro soldiers of the United States in the wars 1775 to 1812. 1861 to 65, written in 1890 by Joseph T. Wilson, a Black Civil War veteran of the 54th Massachusetts Volunteers. Although not as detailed as Livermore's writings on the Revolution, Wilson's better understanding of soldiers and the Army is evident. From the latter years of the 19th century until the mid-20th, African American periodicals such as the Negro History Bulletin and the Journal of Negro History became the primary sources for publishing additional information on Black participation in the Revolution. The beginnings of the Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s and the approach of the Civil War centennial produced greater interest in Black history and influenced the award of academic grants to fund extensive research. Articles began to appear in scholarly university and state historical commission journals. In 1962, the University of North Carolina Press published for the Institute of Early American History and Culture the most detailed work to date. Benjamin Quarles, supported by multiple grants, including a John S. Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship and a leave of absence from the faculty of Morgan State College, became the esteemed expert on the subject as a result of The Negro in the American Revolution. Despite his propensity to include every bit of information he discovered in his decade of research, his lack of military experience, and his efforts to placate his funding sources, agendas that occasionally show through, Quarles's book is magnificent. The opening sentence of his preface has become the most quoted single sentence on black involvement in the rebellion. In the Revolutionary War, the American Negro was a participant and a symbol. Sidney Kaplan, who was an emeritus professor of English and Afro-American Studies at the University of Massachusetts, and Emma Nogridy Kaplan, former reference librarian at Smith College, added the wonderfully illustrated The Black Presence in the Era of the American Revolution. The Kaplans include a section on black military participation, but their major contribution is in telling the story of African-American businessmen, clergymen, artists, and other contributors to arts and commerce of the period. Today, African Americans serve in every specialty and at every rank in the U.S. Armed Forces. The story of their long struggle for opportunity and equality, much of which began during the Revolution, has not always been told well, if at all. The author's hope is that the following chapters will give credit where it is due and fill in missing information about African American contributions to the Revolutionary War previously left blank. 1. African American Heroes of the Revolution. It was early on the evening of April 18, 1775, when Paul Revere and William Dawes spotted the two lanterns hung in the steeple of Boston's North Church. In response to this prearranged signal, the two men spurred their horses and rode into the night to warn American rebels. "The British are coming! The British are coming!" shouted the riders as they raced from village to farm. At the alarm, local militiamen rose from their beds in mansions, small houses, and slave quarters to secure their weapons and assemble with their units. The British were indeed advancing north from Boston toward the villages of Lexington and Concord with 6 companies of light infantry totaling nearly 400 men. Their orders from General Thomas Gage were simple. Having received intelligence that a quantity of ammunition, provisions, artillery, tents, and small arms have been collected at Concord for the avowed purpose of raising and supporting a rebellion against His Majesty, you will march the corps of grenadiers and light infantry under your command with the utmost expedition and secrecy to Concord, where you will seize and destroy all military stores whatever. Revere's and Dawes's warnings provided the local Minutemen time to prepare for the British advance. By morning, Lexington Militia Company Commander Captain John Parker stood with about 75 men in a staggered line across the 2-acre common located in the center of the village. The captain's orders to his company typified the feelings of many of the colonists. "Stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." Footnote. As with many other famous quotes and stories from the American Revolution, the accuracy of Parker's words is difficult to verify. As glorious and patriotic as they may sound, they did not appear in print until 1858 and were credited to the recollection of Parker's grandson. End of footnote. Parker and his militiamen, tired of British taxation and oppression, were determined to defend their village and their perceptions of freedom and liberty. The irony, of course, was that neither Parker nor any of the other white participants appear to have appreciated the fact that their ranks contained several men to whom freedom would not apply. The very patriots who professed the desire for liberty for all did not mean literally all. In the small company, several armed African Americans stood alongside their owners, prepared to secure a freedom hitherto denied their race. Footnote. As noted earlier, Enlistment documents and unit rosters, if they exist at all, seldom recorded the race of participants in the American Revolution, making it difficult to determine the exact numbers and origins of those who fought. End of footnote. The ragtag white and black militia company made little impression on the more experienced, much larger British force. Even the first gunfire of the Revolution, the famous shot heard round the world, initiated by an unidentified source, failed to convince the British that the Americans were serious. The British commander, Major John Pitcairn, merely ordered a volley of fire over the heads of the Lexington militia. He then demanded the surrender of weapons. When Parker apparently instructed his men to comply, some laid down their muskets, while others began to walk away. But then more shots rang out, again their source unidentified, and Pitcairn ordered another volley, this time into the dispersing ranks of the Lexington militiamen. In a matter of a few minutes, 9 American soldiers lay dead, and another 8 were injured. The casualty list itself is telling of the war effort by all participating Americans, for among the wounded was Price Esterbrook, a Negro man, according to the roster of participants and casualties on Lexington Green that appeared in the Salem, Massachusetts, Gazette of April 21, 1775. Another mention of him, in the journals of the Provincial Congress of Massachusetts, also noted the African American's participation in the battle, describing him as Prince, a Negro. Later broadsides also listed the veterans of Lexington Green. An undated one, probably published a few days after the battle and currently on file at the Massachusetts Historical Society, includes the name Princey Easterbrooks, a Negro man, among the casualties at Lexington. Footnote: Revolutionary War documents often include different spellings of the same name. End of footnote. As the British marched from Lexington toward Concord, they encountered more colonial militia units. Again, these ranks contained black members as well as white, for African Americans, both free and slave, assembled with their fellow Minutemen to fend off the British. Among those black Americans taking part in the ensuing battle were Peter Salem and Samuel Craft of Newton, Cato Boardman of Cambridge, Cuff Whittemore and Cato Wood of Arlington, and Pomp Blackman, hometown unknown. While Price Esterbrook had been among the first to shed blood for American independence at Lexington, another black person, unidentified, suffered one of the last wounds of the war's initial day. When blocked by the rebels at Concord Bridge, the British retreated. As they retraced their steps, militiamen pursued, adopting the Native American tactic of firing at the withdrawing force from behind trees, fences, and impromptu fortifications. Just outside Boston, at Charlestown Neck, according to the journal of a British lieutenant in the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, a Negro was wounded near the houses close to the neck, out of which the rebels fired to the last. Although African Americans were among the earliest casualties of the Revolutionary War, Esterbrook and his fellow black militiamen were not the first to shed their blood for American independence from Great Britain. 5 years earlier, Crispus Attucks, an escaped slave-turned-sailor, played a major role in the first confrontation between the rebellious colonists and the British military. In 1770, Americans were chafing under increasing taxes and harsh military occupation by the British Crown. The citizens of Boston particularly disliked the oppression and arrogance of the local British Army garrison, and the long, cold winter did little to cool their tempers. Early in the evening of March 5th, Crispus Attucks joined several of his fellow sailors as they warmed themselves around a public house fire while they awaited their ship to sail from Boston Harbor. Much of their talk focused on the unfair treatment they received at the hands of the British and their animosity toward the redcoat sailors. Attucks participated little in white men's conversation, but he shared their feelings of injustice, perhaps even more so, for the black sailor had escaped slavery to go to sea more than 20 years earlier. Suddenly, the group sharing the fire became aware of excited voices in the street, followed by the ringing of the town's alarm bell. Attucks raced to the door to discover the snow-covered street filled with men moving toward the British headquarters on King Street. Some of the men seemed to be agitating the crowd, while others attempted to stop the mob's progress. A few began to flee. Attucks stopped a young man leaving the scene and asked what was causing the commotion. The youth explained that a British soldier had refused to pay after receiving a haircut and then beat the barber when he demanded his money. Other colonists came to the support of the barber as more soldiers appeared and threatened to shoot if the mob did not disperse. The colonists made a few more verbal retorts at the men in uniform and reluctantly began to drift away. Laughing at the verbal threats, the soldiers marched back to their custom-house barracks. Several accounts of eyewitnesses describe what happened next. Although the stories vary somewhat, all agree that a short, stout, curly-haired black man pushed forward and urged the hesitant crowd to stand up against the soldiers. With the leader now in charge, the colonists followed Attucks to the custom-house, where they threw snowballs and rocks at the buildings and its guards. The frightened sentinels called for reinforcements. Attucks picked up a heavy piece of firewood and shook the club at the soldiers as he dared them to fire. The swelling mob behind him surged even closer to the custom-house. Despite the missiles hurled by the crowd and the threats of the club-wielding Attucks, the disciplined British soldiers adhered to their instructions to fire only upon the orders of their officers. British Captain Thomas Preston arrived and ensured that his men held their fire as he unsuccessfully attempted to convince the mob to disperse. His efforts only made the Bostonians angrier. Attucks, along with a dozen other men, advanced still closer, and the escaped slave began striking a soldier's bayonet with his wooden stick. He then swung his club at Preston's head. As the officer countered with his arm to ward off the blow, he bumped into one of his soldiers, causing the man to drop his weapon. Instantly, Attucks seized the musket. The soldier also grabbed for the gun, and the two struggled for control. In wresting the musket from the black man, the soldier stumbled and fell into the icy slush. The colonists laughed and, now confident that the soldier would not shoot, began to chant, "Why don't you fire? Why don't you fire?" Attucks, leaning on his stick, mockingly stared at the wet, muddy redcoat. Humiliated, the British soldier regained his feet and fired directly into Attucks's chest. Instantly, the other soldier shot into the crowd. Attucks and 5 others lay dead or dying in the street. Despite his color, the colonists hailed the dead Attucks as a hero and the first casualty of what would become the American Revolution. Few acknowledged, however, that Attucks, an escaped slave, would not have been able to share the freedoms for which he sacrificed his life. Attucks would not be the last black man to die for a country and a cause that did not recognize him as an equal or ensure that he turned from the liberty for which he fought. The Boston Massacre, as it became known, fanned the flames of revolution that, in turn, led to open warfare at Lexington and Concord. 2 months after those skirmishes, the war's first major battle took place. Once again, the action occurred in Boston, and as in every fight that followed, black Americans were in the forefront. After the Battle of Concord Bridge, the British withdrew to Boston. During the following weeks, the colonial militias united to surround the port city. In June 1775, as they tightened their cordon around Boston, the rebel commanders decided to send a force to occupy Bunker Hill on the narrow peninsula at the end of Charlestown Neck, at the city's edge. Upon arrival, the American commander discovered that adjacent Breed's Hill offered more defendable ground and established his force there. History would record the upcoming battle as Bunker Hill, but in actuality it was on Breed's Hill that the Patriots and their opponents' blood would soak the ground. In the militia ranks on Breed's Hill were at least a dozen African Americans, including several veterans of the earlier skirmishes. On June 17th, the British attacked in waves from the beach. The dug-in Americans waited, as ordered by Colonel William Prescott, until they could see the whites of their eyes, and initially slowed the attacking redcoats. Black and white Americans stood together to resist the assault, but ultimately a shortage of ammunition and the superior numbers of the British finally forced the rebels to retreat. One of the last to withdraw was Cuff Whittemore of Captain Benjamin Locke's Arlington, Massachusetts militia company. According to Samuel Swett, the earliest historian of the battle, in his Notes to his Sketch of Bunker Hill Battle, published in 1825, Whittemore fought bravely in the redoubt. He had a ball through his hat, and he fought to the last, and when compelled to retreat, though wounded, he seized the sword of a dead British officer. Footnote: that white officers allowed a black private to keep and later sell a captured officer's sword is substantial evidence of the respect his superiors had for Whittemore and his performance in the battle. End of footnote. Another black soldier achieved even more fame for his valor at the Battle of Bunker Hill. Peter Salem, claiming as his last name the town near his Farmington, Massachusetts birthplace, was born in about 1750 to a slave held by Jeremiah Belknap. Peter grew into a tall young man of great physical strength and vigor. Sold shortly before the Revolution began to Major Lawson Buckminster, Peter Salem joined his owner's militia regiment and saw his first military action at Concord Bridge on April 19, 1775. Still enslaved, Salem enlisted a few weeks later in the 1st Massachusetts Regiment, commanded by Colonel Thomas Nixon, and on June 17th stood in the trenches on Bunker Hill with his fellow white and black soldiers. Varying accounts exist of Salem's performance in the battle, but all agree as to his courage under fire. At the center of all the stories is the fate of British Royal Marine Major John Pitcairn. Major Pitcairn, a veteran of the battles of Lexington Green and Concord Bridge, anticipated the battle with relish. Shortly before the fight, the major stopped in a Boston tavern for a glass of brandy. As he spun his finger in the glass, he boasted, "I will thus stir the Yankee blood before night." After the initial volleys of rebel fire from Bunker Hill into the advancing British, Pitcairn and his fellow officers rallied their troops for repeated assaults. As the British line closed on the rebel trenches, Pitcairn shouted, "The day is ours!" Amid the hail of gunfire and smoke, Salem took careful aim at the British officer and calmly shot him through the chest. The mortally wounded Pitcairn fell into the arms of his son, a Marine lieutenant in his father's regiment. Several of the battle's witnesses noted Salem's actions in their diaries or later writings. Jeremiah Belknap, Salem's original owner, wrote in his diary in 1787 that a Bunker Hill veteran told him, "A Negro man took aim at Major Pitcairn as he was rallying the dispersed British troops and shot him through the head." An eyewitness report, referenced in a letter by Aaron White of Thompson, Connecticut, provides what appears to be the most accurate account. According to White, the eyewitness told him in 1807, "The British Major Pitcairn had passed the storm of our fire and had mounted the redoubt, when, waving his sword, he commanded in a loud voice the rebels to surrender. His sudden appearance and his commanding air at first startled the men immediately below him. They neither answered or fired, probably not being exactly certain what was to be done. At this critical moment, a Negro soldier stepped forward and, aiming his musket at the major's bosom, blew him through." Salem's officers later introduced him to General George Washington as the man who shot Pitcairn. More acclaim for the performances of Salem and other black men at Bunker Hill resulted from a painting by John Trumbull, who witnessed the battle from Roxbury across the harbor. 11 years after the battle, Trumbull unveiled The Battle of Bunker Hill, which prominently shows a black servant handing a Connecticut officer a musket in the midst of the fight. At the center top of the painting is another black soldier. Trumbull's work, hailed as a classic of realistic military history paintings, today hangs in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda in Washington, D.C. Engravings of the painting appeared on private notes issued by Boston and other banks. The painting increased the awareness that black Americans played a significant role in America's struggle for independence, but some writers have misidentified the prominent servant at the right of the painting as Salem. Actually, the much smaller image of a black soldier at the top of the painting is more likely the heroic slayer of Major Pitcairn. While official accounts of the actions by individual soldiers, white or black, during the Revolution are extremely rare, still another African American performed so well at Bunker Hill that his actions too made written history. Salem Poor, a 28-year-old freeman from Andover, Massachusetts, enlisted in Captain Benjamin Ames's militia company shortly before the battle. 6 months after the fight, 14 officers petitioned the General.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?